Shalom. Welcome back to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. We're very happy that you've joined us today. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. We invite you to check out the website, jewishsacredaging.com. Email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. It is with a tremendous amount of pleasure and a lot of anticipation that we welcome to today's edition Dr. Stephen Spector, a professor emeritus at Stony Brook University and the author of this is a great book. Let me get that out of the way first. My colleagues you're looking for some stuff for book groups or adult education for the coming program year, check this out. This is a book called God and the First Families, Parenting, Trauma, and Healing in the Book of Genesis. It is not a beach read, but it is I think a very, very important book, especially with the holidays coming up. You may want to, for those of you looking for some additional interpretation of Genesis 22. But anyway, I'm the head of the story here. Stephen, welcome. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
I'm certainly aging, so I feel appropriate to the show.
Let's not go there. Anyway, not right now anyway. God and the First Families. When I teach Genesis or stuff like this, I always go back to an article that from a journal that is long since out of print. The subject of the article was transgenerational pathology in the book of Genesis. And it took a look at the three patriarchal families, and how pathology is transferred from generation to generation to generation. And I'm very serious to my colleagues or adult education people out there or directors of education, lifelong learning people. Check this book out. Let me get this out of the way real fast. It's JPS, Jewish Publication Society book, available, Stephen, at the usual suspects, Amazon, bookstores, et cetera, et cetera. I want to imagine at the JPS, Jewish Publication Society website as well.
Oh, yeah.
This book takes a look at trauma theory in many ways. Could you explain to me what exactly is trauma theory? And you link it, this is really cool, to post-exilic construction. Was this Torah put together and all these stories on a psychological level a result of the trauma of the Babylonian exile?
That's one theory. And there are actually two practitioners who've applied it to Genesis, two theorists. It had been applied especially to the prophets and to the wisdom literature. But these two, Dana Nolan Fuel and Kathleen O'Connor, showed the way that trauma theory could be applied to the text and to the Torah itself. It's somewhat different from the body of the book. In the book, I'm looking at individual figures as characters and what they go through and how trauma influences that family. What trauma theory does is they look at the Torah and they say that it represents the psychological needs of the audience, so that almost everything in Genesis, for example, is a kind of a literary refraction of the trauma of having Judah destroyed and the captivity. So they say, for example, what else is the story of the Garden of Eden except exile? And the story of Babel, again, exile. Abraham leaving his home, Hagar having to leave her home, Jacob leaving his, Joseph leaving his. They all say these are ways of dealing with exile and dealing with loss, but indirectly addressing the trauma of the audience's exile. I think it's brilliant. I think it's worthwhile. What I did was somewhat different in this book. I applied trauma to the individual characters, specifically the patriarchs and their families. So for that, I read trauma literature, the legitimate trauma science, for several months and looked at all the possible symptoms and the various expressions of trauma and how it may have affected the family of the patriarchs. All of them, almost everyone in Genesis, and specifically the ancestors, experience extreme distress at some time. We could call it trauma. Trauma is used generally in a kind of a broad sense today. Almost anything that people feel is intensely unpleasant and sticks with them, they call traumatic. And that's fine. It's one of the entries in the Oxford English Dictionary for the word. But trauma is also a clinical term, and it's used to describe a series of symptoms of various gradations, so that Clinical trauma basically is the experience of being overwhelmed by something in life, biologically and emotionally and intellectually overwhelmed. And the result is that systems close down. So people who've had trauma in the clinical sense can't put the narrative together. It's hard for them to process and digest what happened because it's hard to do that. Very often the symptoms are reliving it in dreams or something like that. What I was trying to do with Genesis was to see the extent to which the extreme distress that I mentioned could actually have been trauma, and in particular for Isaac. In the book, I'm focusing on Isaac as a kind of transition point for the family.
Now, the first word in the subtitle is parenting.
Yeah.
So is Genesis also, because you make the point, a book about parenting?
I think absolutely yes. Now, this is my 9th book. I didn't need another book, another scholarly book. I wanted it to be something that helps people, as you do, and all the work that you do, addressing real life issues. So I looked at the 4 main types of parenting in the United States that psychologists recognize, and also at the 4 main perceptions of who God is in the Baylor survey of religion, and put those 2 patterns together and used it as a lens to look at the various stories one by one in Genesis. And sure enough, it does appear that God uses one style of parenting when it's appropriate and then switches to another. And finally, at the end, invents the kind of parenting that psychologists today have rediscovered independently and called the best kind of parenting.
Yeah. Any student of Torah who reads the book, who reads the 5 books, understands that authoritarian segment. When we teach, and Steve's our producer, studies the Torah with me sometimes during the month, and we always talk about the Torah God. It's very simple. You either do it my way or I kill you. Very simple rule, as opposed to, I think you conclude this authoritative branch of parenting, which is, I think, just said as a more contemporary concept. What's the difference between that authoritarian and authoritative?
We all have a general concept of what authoritarianism is from history and politics, but it's a parenting style. It's a choice that many parents make. It means that what they really are interested in raising their kids is the obedience and submission to authority. And they regard that as more important actually than creativity. So the authoritarian parent gives rules as edicts. There's no backtalk. There's no conversation, and there's no attempt to explain the rules. Because the authoritarian parent feels that in order to have a child who fits in well with his family and into society, they need to have respect for society and for the family. And that comes from obedience and accepting your position in the hierarchy of things. In Genesis, God begins as an absolute authoritarian, as you just said. God says, let there be, let this be divided, and it happens. In the portrayal of humans, however, it's not quite that simple. Humans are more unpredictable, more fragile, and things don't go as smoothly as they do during the creation. So God tries the same approach. He doesn't, for example, tell Adam and Eve why they shouldn't eat the fruit. It's a great question. People have debated it for millennia, but he doesn't explain why. He gives no explanation and doesn't invite conversation. It's wrong simply because God says it's wrong. And then when he punishes them, he doesn't tell Eve why. He just says, I'm punishing you. And he doesn't tell Adam why, except that you listened to your wife and you disobeyed. That is through a couple other times as well, especially at the flood. There's really no attempt to redeem or explain why things are as evil as God says they are. The imagination of man's heart is continually evil all the time. But there's no attempt to redeem them. Apparently they're irredeemable at that point. So God resorts to the kind of authoritarian punishment which absolutely eliminates the rebellion. But he looks down afterwards and he says a line that a lot of people have read, but I thought was particularly meaningful if you're looking at it from the point of view of parenting. He says, I'm never going to do this again. because, and that's the important thing, I won't do it again because humans are evil and there's no way to eliminate that impulse toward evil. It's simply because he knows who they are. He's seen from the examples of parenting that he's done so far that the extreme authoritarian approach doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't eliminate evil. And so from that point on, we get to the calling of Abraham, God applies another approach of parenting. And by the end of Genesis, he's invented a third approach. And that's the approach you just mentioned. It sounds like authoritarian, but it's authoritative. And it's really, in a way, the opposite. Because in that instance, authoritative parents today want their children to understand the reasons behind the rules, the ethics behind them, and the morality and the empathy that comes with understanding when you harm others, what it feels like. That the authoritarian parent is interested in obedience. The authoritative parent is interested in the personal growth, the moral and emotional growth of the child. And that's what I see in God as he educates Jacob's sons, as they begin to see for themselves that what they did to Joseph is happening to them and it hurts.
You alluded to a couple of the great stories, the flood story that you unpack, and the second creation story from Genesis 2:4 and on. You write in the book of the first commandment, pru or vu, have kids, but the text says nothing about how to raise them, which is a great line. It doesn't say pru or vu. And by the way, implicit in the education is, and by the way, here's a list of mitzvahs and things that you should do to help you, but not just have kids. The rest is up, it's up to you. Stephen, in your analysis, especially in the beginning of the book of Genesis, I'm fascinated by some of the things in Genesis 3, which is my favorite chapter in Torah, about the relationship of Adam and Eve. And you make the point that Adam is very passive. He just accepts. And the relationship then with Eve and then with the serpent and then obviously with God. He doesn't get that impression like in Sunday school classes or a lot of sermons. How do you understand Adam's passivity? Because he does. He just, my wife, and his response is, yeah, I didn't do anything. My wife made me do it. It's like right out of every, like, no, my wife, she made me do it. I did it. I want to make her happy. So I ate the apple.
Well, the silences in Torah invite theology and criticism and the use of the imagination. So commentators have had a lot of fun trying to figure out why Adam is so silent and so passive. We can use some of the evidence in the text. So what we can see is that neither Eve nor the serpent thinks that Adam has to be seduced. The serpent spends a lot of time working on her, doesn't pay attention to Adam at all. And some of the later commentators have said, well, that's because Adam was so intellectually strong and she was so weak. So he didn't even try. He got to him through his wife. But if you just look at the evidence of the text, she's got the lively imagination. She's the one who wanted that fruit because it looks so good and because it expands the mind. And it appeals to her senses as well as her curiosity, whereas he doesn't have any of those experiences. I think there's no reason to think that she's not the more intellectually powerful one in that particular story. But when she hands him the fruit, he simply eats. There's no objection, no theology, no reminder, look, this is what God said. So the critics later on, the poets, John Milton and others, Mark Twain, they thought it was because he loved her and he's going to die with her. And so one of the rabbinical interpretations is that she didn't want him to outlive her and marry somebody else. But I think none of those things is inherent. But I think that maybe the story of Adam and Eve is a love story. And it may be that she thinks that the fruit is good for you. And therefore, she makes him eat it, which is what my wife does to me.
All the time.
Right.
Eat it. Good for you. But
Yeah.
you write in the book, this is why I'm fascinated by the book, because you raise so many very, very interesting questions that a class should be able to spend hours on. But again, back to this chapter You're right. It's going to be on page 35. I'll quote because I don't want to misrepresent it. And then you'll tell me if I mess this up. Ironically, even as Eve's crime was used to justify the calumny heaped on women for centuries, textual evidence suggests that there may have been a gender reversal in this episode, that man and woman may have been switched in at least part of the story. Eve created first, and the men who wrote these stories subconsciously then created this anti-feminist concept. Am I understanding that right? Or am I totally out in left field with no chance of getting the fly ball?
I hope this isn't going to get me hanged.
Nothing will get you hanged.
But there are three things wrong with the story of Adam and Eve. First of all, it says that when he sees her, he says, "This at last is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone." And therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife. The first thing wrong is that's not what happened historically. In that culture, men didn't leave their father and mother. It was the other way around. Women left their home and went to live with the men. And everyone reading that would have known it. All right. Another thing, and this is where I really have to be as delicate as I can be. If you think about what the representation of sexuality is in the passage, it is that it's the return of flesh and bone. It is that this is the missing piece, and therefore a man cleaves to his wife. He says, "That's my flesh, that's my bone," and therefore he cleaves to her, which is generally accepted as having sex. But that's not what heterosexual male experience is. It isn't that the woman returns the missing bone and flesh. Metaphorically, it's the opposite, if you think metaphorically. And then the third thing is clearly it's explaining something historically that doesn't exist in reality. That is that man is born before woman. So it's a kind of audacious case I'm making, but it's not out of the blue, because through much of the creation story, the text draws on the neighbor's myths, the creation myths, and owns them and rebukes them. The serpent is no longer a god. It's just a creature that's going to have its head trudged on. Okay. The stars are not inhabited by divinities. The stars are just God's creation. And even some of the most serious and conservative Jewish scholars have said that Eve seems to be possibly from a feminist myth that was transformed in Genesis. So I'm thinking it isn't that unusual for the Hebrew text to take and rebuke and reverse.
Oh, no.
Many of the logical stories.
There's a book somewhere back there called Myth, Legend, and Custom in the Old Testament. I think it's by Theodore Gasser. But it's this thick, or that thick, and he takes every story and traces it back to a pre-Hebraic myth. And so here in Philly at the University of Pennsylvania, Pritchard, who dug up a lot of these clay tablets that from the Enuma Elish and all the Sumerian mythologies, he actually annotates some of the Torah with the lines from these Sumerian texts. And even, as you know, some of the early words were taken from Sumerian gods and transformed into Hebrew. You also write sort of like a mini confessional at the beginning of the book, which says, quote, "I am a skeptic who deeply believes in God," unquote. Now, that may describe the majority of people who are members of my synagogue, but what does it mean to you?
Then I have to give a little biographical background. When I was 15 and my mother was 40, she was diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer. And the surgeon, who was an eminent physician at Sloan Kettering in New York, said that she only had a couple of weeks. He couldn't get out all the malignant tissue, and chemo wasn't effective with that type of cancer. So I did what a 15-year-old kid would do. I made a bargain with God, and that if my mother could have 20 more years, then I would do this and I wouldn't do that. And the cancer went away, and she lived another 41 years and died of other causes. So I'm sure there was a medical explanation, but in my view, I have to accept that for me, that was a miracle. So I deeply do believe in God. But it wasn't that much later that I began to read Holocaust literature, because this was all 1961, it happened. And the knowledge of the Holocaust was spreading in America in the 60s. And quite sincerely, how could I explain that my prayer would be answered and the prayers of millions of people who are no doubt better human beings and certainly better Jews than I was would be answered? That left me with a kind of skepticism. Prayer is not answered, good people sent to their deaths. On the other hand, my experience, it didn't negate my experience. And that's the dual attitude that I bring to the text. A willingness to respect the text as divine inspiration, but also kind of scientific skepticism that needs to be given voice.
Who is the God of the Akedah? Is that another aspect of that authoritarian, take your son, your only son? In the nature of the parenting situation, the role of God, that's a rather stark thing. Right after God says to Hagar, look, just go listen to Sarah. You're going to be okay. Your son's going to be a progenitor of a huge nation. Next chapter, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him.
That's the most shocking and frightening story in the Torah, as far as I'm concerned. And that it's even more so because I mentioned earlier that God invents a new kind of parenting after he decides that authoritarianism doesn't work.
Right.
And that seems to be a kind of benign parenting, almost even permissive, because when he calls Abraham, almost immediately after he summons him and blesses him, Abraham gives his wife away, as if the promises had never been made. And God does not rebuke him and does not punish him. And that could be called permissiveness, because that's a style of parenting. But if you look at the four types of God as they're understood, it's a kind of a benign God. It's a kind of generous God. To switch from that to take your son up to the mountain and kill him with no explanation and no prologue, that's pure authoritarianism. And that had to be explained. Why would God have that sudden reversal after he'd already realized authoritarianism is not the best way to deal with families and with humans who are fragile and given to sin and failures and frailty? I have an explanation I offer, and that is that Abraham has given his wife away, and twice, and he has laughed at God when God said to him, after many other times, he says, once again, your wife is going to have a son. She's almost 100. She's 90. You're going to have a son with her. And he falls on his face and laughs. That seems to me to be very serious. Like, if God is choosing Abraham to be the model for the future, and he explains at one point why he chose Abraham. He said, so that he can teach justice and righteousness through his sons. But if Abraham can give his wife away a second time, even in old age, after all he's been through, in my opinion, my judgment is that God then feels he has to pass a test to prove that he's worthy of the covenant. And that's what the Akedah is. And he does. Even he proves the angel says, you've proved you fear God.
Right.
That appears to be what the test was.
Just when you mentioned the two times that Abraham gives away his wife, are you talking about the wife-sister motif that appears? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. When they go to Egypt and Pharaoh says, well, that's really not your sister, is it? Come clean, Abraham. This idea of the God of the Akedah is sort of like getting back at Abraham for this ruse of the wife-sister thing, correct? Is that what I'm hearing?
But I don't think it's revenge. I think he needs to test Abraham's character. Abraham, in both those instances, in Egypt and in Gerar, he seems to fear man more than he fears God, or to be more in awe of man than in God. But I think that's a recurring motif in Genesis. When humans are afraid for their lives, They abandon their best selves. They abandon their faith, and they abandon the people who count on them. It
Well,
happens.
yeah,
happens.
this is a theme that appears in Torah. I mean, a couple of weeks ago when we did Prasha Devarim in Moses' first recapitulation sermon, he says, you went to war. You didn't trust God. God says, I'm going to say, you didn't trust God. And you lost the war. It's the wilderness experience. It's fascinating in so many different ways. But I do want to reach, because before we start running out of time, I do want to return to something you alluded to at the beginning, because it is a major, part of Torah, but also a fascinating part of Torah that you mentioned. Talk to me about this very, very strange, interesting, introspective patriarch called Isaac. He's a very, very interesting character, isn't he?
Many of the literary critics who write about Isaac consider him basically the Nebuch in the family. He's fearful, he's feckless, and he's weak. That's what they say. What I was saying at the very beginning was, it seems to me that if you look at Isaac more sympathetically, we don't know whether he was a child or whether he was an adult, and rabbis thought he was an adult. Harold Bloom thought he was a child. The medieval Christians portrayed him as a child when he was brought up to the mountain because it fit with their typology of God sacrificing the son. But in any event, Abraham doesn't tell him what he's doing or why. He has opportunities, but he doesn't. Brings him up to the mountain and offers him as an olah, a whole burnt offering, also known in Greek as a holocaust. And Elie Wiesel actually says Isaac was the first Holocaust survivor and a Holocaust victim. What a whole burnt offering involved was gruesome. It meant chopping up the body of the animal and then discarding the skin and burning the flesh. And that was what Abraham was prepared to do to his son. Isaac, in Jewish commentary and the rabbinic commentary, Isaac volunteered, and that eliminates any possibility of trauma. But if we don't bring that outside information in, which is not based on anything in the text, if you only imagine Isaac's experience of it, it seems to me that that is one of the most potent traumas that anyone can go through. And Bessel van der Kolk, who's maybe the most outstanding trauma expert now, says that the experience of being victimized by someone you trust and depend on is one of the most powerful sources of trauma. Whereas the feeling of being loved and safe in childhood virtually inoculates you against trauma. It helps you build resilience. And that's one of the main lessons in Genesis, which I do want to make here. And that is the power of love in the text to build emotional strength and resilience. But what happens to Isaac is the opposite. And rather than call him a weakling, I would say he's somebody who went through an existential threat and was traumatized by it in recognizable ways. If you look at all the trauma literature that's out there, all the reports of what trauma victims go through, he goes through many of them.
The book ends, Genesis ends, with the deathbed blessing, which I guess you can interpret it as a sense of a family coming together. Whether there's love there, that's another story, because Reuben doesn't come off very well. But there is this transformation that takes place, I think, in many ways through Joseph, who seems to me anyway is like a transformational character that leads us into the bringing of the bones back. There is a sense of a reunion of this is our family. God and the first families, parenting, trauma, and healing in the book of Genesis. Again, to my colleagues, adult education, lifelong learning people, book club people, take a look at this book. I think your brain will be just alive. There's so many things in here that really touch on so many of our own personal journeys. and our own ability to seek resilience out of our own personal traumas and bringing it back to the text, which is absolutely super. Stephen, thank you very much. I
Thank you.
really appreciate it. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And I hope many people use it in the way that it just stimulates your brain. I loved reading it. So thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. Stay healthy. Stay healthy. To all of you, thank you very much for listening and enjoying, I hope, today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Please check out the website, jewishsacredaging.com. You'll find a very conveniently located donate button. And if you'd like to support the work of these podcasts in Jewish Sacred Aging, please just click on it and follow the prompts. We really do appreciate your support. Seekers of Meaning is recorded at the broadcast centers of Lubetkin Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And a big shout out to our genius guru of electronics, Steve Lubetkin. Until we see each other again at the next Seekers of Meaning, please take care of yourself, stay healthy, and most of all, be kind to one another. Shalom.